The moment Johnny Cash pushed $2,000 across the studio table, every conversation in the room died. Elvis Presley stared at the money. Then he slowly looked up at Johnny. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The musicians who had been tuning their guitars suddenly seemed afraid to make a sound. The engineer behind the glass stopped adjusting the controls. Even the laughter that had filled the little recording room only moments earlier disappeared, as if someone had switched it off. Johnny Cash leaned back in his chair. He looked completely relaxed. That was what made the moment so dangerous. He wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to insult Elvis. He was smiling. A confident, almost mischievous smile that said he already knew how this was going to end. $2,000, Johnny repeated. Elvis glanced at the stack again. Then he looked at Johnny. Johnny tapped the money with 2 fingers. "Sing this better than me," he said, "and it's yours." A few musicians laughed nervously. Elvis didn't. He simply lowered his eyes toward the acoustic guitar resting against his knee. His fingers slowly moved across the strings. One quiet chord filled the room. Johnny's smile widened. He thought Elvis was nervous. He thought the challenge had finally made the young singer uncomfortable. What Johnny didn't understand was that Elvis wasn't afraid of losing. He was deciding how to answer. And when Elvis finally raised his eyes, there was a completely different expression on his face. Calm, focused, almost playful. "All right, Johnny," Elvis said quietly. He stood. "You asked for it." Nobody laughed this time. Because something about the way Elvis said those words changed the atmosphere completely. The room suddenly felt smaller. The microphones seemed closer. The air seemed heavier. Johnny slowly folded his arms across his chest. "All right," he said, "let's hear it." Elvis walked toward the microphone. His boots made a soft sound against the wooden floor. He adjusted the microphone. Then he pulled the guitar strap over his shoulder. The musicians exchanged glances. Nobody had planned for this. It had started as a joke, a little friendly teasing between 2 young men who were already becoming giants in the world of American music. But now the joke had become a challenge, and everyone wanted to know what Elvis would do. Johnny Cash had a voice that carried history inside it. Deep, dark, weathered. When Johnny sang, it sounded as though he had lived every word before he ever spoke it. Elvis was different. His voice could be powerful, tender, dangerous, fragile. He could move from a whisper to a roar in a matter of seconds. But inside this small studio, Elvis had something to prove. Not to the audience, not to the musicians, to Johnny. Johnny leaned forward. "Ready?" Elvis nodded. "Ready." The engineer lifted his hand. The room became silent. Elvis placed his fingers on the guitar. He played the first chord. Soft, simple, almost hesitant. Johnny's eyes remained fixed on him. Another chord, then another. Elvis lowered his head slightly, and when he began singing, the sound was nothing like the explosive performer people would later associate with the name Elvis Presley. There was no swagger, no dramatic movement, no attempt to dominate the room. His voice was quiet, warm, almost vulnerable. Johnny's smile disappeared. He listened. Elvis continued. The first verse passed slowly. The words seemed to float through the room. The musicians didn't move. Nobody wanted to interrupt the atmosphere Elvis was creating. Johnny sat perfectly still. His arms were still crossed, but his posture had changed. He was leaning forward now, listening, really listening. Elvis closed his eyes. His fingers moved gently across the guitar. The song began to breathe. And then his voice changed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just enough. A little more power, a little more emotion, a little more pain. Johnny's eyebrows lifted. One of the musicians looked toward the engineer. The engineer simply watched. Elvis reached the next verse. His voice grew stronger. He wasn't trying to imitate Johnny. That was becoming obvious. He wasn't trying to sound like country music. He was taking the song somewhere else entirely. Johnny had expected a competition. Instead, Elvis was telling a story. A story about someone who had loved deeply. Someone who had lost. Someone who knew what it meant to lie awake at night, remembering a person who was no longer there. The room became completely still. Elvis's fingers pressed harder against the strings. His voice cracked slightly. The imperfection made the performance more powerful. Johnny noticed it immediately. He knew singers. He knew technique. He knew when a voice was being controlled and when emotion was taking control of the singer. This was the second kind. Elvis wasn't performing anymore. He was feeling. Johnny slowly lowered his arms. His eyes never left Elvis. The $2,000 on the table no longer mattered. The musicians seemed to realize it too. One of them quietly stopped playing. Another rested his hand on the side of his guitar. Nobody wanted to compete with what was happening in that room. Elvis reached the emotional center of the song. His eyes remained closed. His voice became softer, almost a whisper. Johnny leaned closer. For the first time that evening, the confident expression was completely gone from his face. He wasn't watching a rival. He was watching another artist reveal something personal. Elvis took a breath, then continued. His voice rose. The final verse approached. The room seemed to tighten around him. The engineer stared through the glass. The musicians were motionless. Johnny's expression had changed again. There was something almost stunned in his eyes. He had heard Elvis sing before. Everyone had. But this wasn't the Elvis they knew from the radio. This was something smaller, more intimate, more human. Elvis reached the final lines. His voice trembled. He didn't hide it. He allowed the tremble to remain. Then he lowered his head. One final chord. One final note. And then silence. Complete silence. Nobody clapped. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to remember the $2,000 sitting on the table. Elvis slowly opened his eyes. For a moment, he looked almost uncertain. He looked toward Johnny. Johnny didn't move. Elvis waited. Then Johnny slowly stood. He walked toward him, step by step. The room watched. Johnny stopped directly in front of Elvis. Elvis lowered his guitar. Johnny looked at him, then at the guitar, then back at Elvis. A small smile appeared, but it wasn't the confident smile from earlier. It was something different. Respect. Deep, genuine respect. Johnny shook his head. Man. Elvis smiled slightly. Well. Johnny laughed softly. You know what just happened? Elvis raised an eyebrow. What? Johnny pointed toward the table. You just made me forget about the money. A few musicians laughed. Elvis looked toward the $2,000. Johnny walked over and picked it up. He held the money in his hand. For a second, Elvis expected him to hand it over. Instead, Johnny folded the bills. Then he put them back into his pocket. Elvis stared at him. "Hey!" Johnny laughed. "You earned it." Elvis smiled. "So give it to me." Johnny shook his head. "That's not the point anymore." Elvis laughed. "You made a bet." "I know. And I won." Johnny looked at him. "Yes." Elvis smiled. "Then pay me." The room finally erupted in laughter. Johnny shook his head. "All right, you want the truth." Elvis nodded. Johnny stepped closer. "You didn't beat me." Elvis frowned. Johnny continued. "You made me forget we were competing." The laughter disappeared. The musicians looked at each other. Johnny's voice became quieter. "That is different." Elvis stared at him. Johnny looked toward the microphone. "I've heard singers with bigger voices." He paused. "I've heard singers with more training." Another pause. "But when you started singing." Johnny shook his head. "I forgot to listen for mistakes." Elvis didn't know what to say. Johnny continued. "I was listening for the truth." The room remained silent. Elvis looked down. For a moment, the young superstar didn't look like a celebrity. He looked like a musician hearing something he needed to hear. Johnny reached for his guitar. He pulled a chair beside Elvis. Then he sat down. "You know what?" Elvis looked at him. "What?" Johnny smiled. "Let's do it again." Elvis laughed. "Again?" "Yeah." "You want another bet?" Johnny shook his head. "No more bets." He adjusted his guitar. "No competition." Elvis watched him. Johnny looked toward the engineer. "Roll it." The engineer reached for the controls. The musicians quickly moved into position. Elvis adjusted his microphone. Johnny looked at him. "This time." He paused. "We do it together." Elvis smiled. "All right." The first chord came from Johnny's guitar. Deep. Warm. Then Elvis joined. Their voices entered separately. Johnny's low voice carried the weight of country music. Elvis's voice rose above it, emotional and clear. Then something unexpected happened. They stopped sounding like two singers. They sounded like one story. The musicians stared through the glass. The engineer slowly leaned toward the console. Nobody wanted to touch anything. Johnny looked at Elvis. Elvis looked back. There was no rivalry now. Only recognition. Two completely different voices. Two different backgrounds. Two different musical worlds. And yet somehow they fit. The song built. Johnny's voice became stronger. Elvis answered. The guitars moved together. The room seemed to disappear. For a few minutes, there were no careers. No records. No fame. No $2,000. Just music. When the final chord came, Johnny let his hand rest on the strings. Elvis lowered his guitar. Silence returned. Johnny looked at Elvis. Then he smiled. "You know what scares me?" Elvis laughed. "What?" Johnny pointed at him. "You're getting better." Everyone laughed. Elvis grinned. "I thought you said there was no competition." "There isn't." Johnny paused. "I'm just warning you." Elvis laughed again. The tension had completely disappeared. But then Johnny became serious. He looked directly at Elvis. "Can I tell you something?" Elvis nodded. Johnny leaned forward. "Don't ever let anybody convince you that you have to sound like somebody else." Elvis listened. "You've got your own thing." Johnny tapped his chest. "That voice is yours." Elvis smiled. Johnny continued. "People are going to try to put you in a box." He shook his head. "Don't stay in it." Elvis looked at him quietly. Those words would stay with him. Because Johnny wasn't just talking about singing. He was talking about the future. The pressure. The expectations. The fame that was already beginning to surround Elvis. Johnny knew what it meant to be watched. He knew what it meant for people to decide who you were before you had the chance to decide for yourself. And now he was warning Elvis. "Whatever happens," Johnny said, "don't lose the reason you started singing." Elvis looked down at his guitar. Then back at Johnny. "Music." Johnny smiled. "No." Elvis waited. "Feeling." Johnny tapped the microphone. "That's what people remember." The room became quiet again. Elvis nodded. "I won't forget." Johnny smiled. Then he stood. The two men shook hands. But Johnny didn't let go immediately. He looked at Elvis. "You know what?" "What?" "I came in here thinking I was going to win $2,000. Elvis smiled. "And?" Johnny laughed. "And I think I lost something better." "What?" "My excuse." Elvis frowned. "Your excuse for what?" Johnny pointed at the microphone. "Thinking I'd already heard everything." Elvis smiled. Johnny released his hand. "That voice." He shook his head. "I wasn't ready for that." Elvis looked toward the table. The $2,000 was still there, untouched. But neither man cared anymore. The bet had begun as a joke. It had become a challenge. And somehow it had ended as respect. But neither Johnny nor Elvis knew that the recording they had just made would become something much more important than either of them expected. Because one person in the studio had been quietly watching everything. The engineer. And after everyone left the room, he stayed behind. He listened to the recording again. Then again. And again. Finally, he picked up the telephone. There was something he needed to tell someone. Because what he had just heard wasn't simply two famous singers making music. It was something rare. Something that could not be recreated easily. And the next morning, when Johnny Cash heard what the engineer had done with that recording, he would make a decision that would surprise even Elvis. If you're watching this story from somewhere in the world, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying these emotional stories about music legends, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Because what happened after that recording ended would make the $2,000 bet seem like the smallest part of the story. The engineer slowly pressed play one more time. Johnny's voice filled the empty studio. Then Elvis's. And somewhere between the two voices, something unforgettable had been captured. The recording ended. But the engineer didn't move. He remained seated behind the console, staring through the glass at the empty studio. Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley were gone. The musicians had left. The microphones had been switched off. The guitars had been placed back in their cases. Even the $2,000 that had started the whole challenge was no longer on the table. But the engineer kept listening. He pressed play again. Johnny's deep voice filled the room. Then Elvis entered. The contrast was almost startling. Johnny sounded like the night. Elvis sounded like fire breaking through the darkness. And somewhere between those two voices, something happened that neither singer had planned. They stopped competing. They started communicating. The engineer leaned back. He had recorded hundreds of performances. He had heard talented singers. He had watched famous musicians create incredible moments. But this was different. There was no polished arrangement, no massive production, no carefully rehearsed choreography. Just two men sitting across from each other with guitars in their hands. And somehow, it felt alive. The engineer reached for the telephone. He hesitated, then dialed a number. When the person answered, he spoke quietly. "You need to hear this." A pause. "No, I'm serious." Another pause. "It's Elvis and Johnny." He looked through the glass. And I don't think either of them realizes what they just did. The next morning, Johnny Cash returned to the studio, expecting an ordinary day. He had forgotten about the recording. He had forgotten about the bet. He had already moved on. But the engineer was waiting for him. Johnny walked through the door, carrying his guitar case. "Morning." The engineer looked nervous. "Johnny." Johnny stopped. "What?" "I need you to hear something." Johnny smiled. "If this is about that $2,000, I'm keeping it." The engineer laughed. "No." He pointed toward the control room. "This is about last night." Johnny's expression changed. "What about it?" "Just listen." Johnny followed him. The engineer pressed play. The first voice came through the speakers. Johnny's own voice. He listened silently. Then Elvis entered. Johnny's eyes narrowed. He heard his own guitar. He heard Elvis's. He heard the slight imperfections. The breathing between lines. The little pauses. The moment where Elvis's voice cracked. And then he heard the final harmony. Johnny stared at the speakers. The engineer watched him carefully. When the recording ended, Johnny didn't speak. The engineer asked, "Well?" Johnny slowly sat down. "Play it again." The engineer did. Johnny listened a second time. This time he closed his eyes. He heard things he hadn't noticed while performing. The emotion, the timing, the way Elvis had followed his phrasing, the way Johnny had instinctively changed his own delivery to meet Elvis. They had been responding to each other without thinking. It was almost like a conversation. When the recording ended again, Johnny opened his eyes. "That's good." The engineer smiled. "Good." Johnny looked at him. "It's better than good." He paused. "It's honest." The engineer nodded. "That was what I thought." Johnny leaned forward. "Where's Elvis?" "He hasn't come in yet." Johnny smiled. "Don't tell him I said this." "What?" Johnny pointed toward the speakers. "That kid is dangerous." The engineer laughed. "Dangerous?" Johnny nodded. "Because he doesn't know how good he is yet." Later that afternoon, Elvis arrived. He walked into the studio wearing a simple shirt and jacket. He looked relaxed. He smiled at the musicians. Then he noticed Johnny. "Morning." Johnny grinned. "Afternoon." Elvis looked suspicious. "What?" Johnny shook his head. "Nothing." Elvis laughed. You're looking at me funny. Am I? Yes. Johnny picked up his guitar. You remember last night? Elvis smiled. The $2,000. Johnny groaned. You're still talking about that. You started it. Johnny laughed. Come here. Elvis walked closer. Johnny pointed toward the speakers. I want you to hear something. Elvis looked at the engineer. The engineer pressed play. Elvis listened. His expression slowly changed. At first, he smiled. Then he became serious. Then completely still. He heard his own voice. He heard Johnny. He heard the moment they came together. When the recording ended, Elvis didn't speak. Johnny looked at him. Well, Elvis swallowed. I didn't know it sounded like that. Johnny smiled. Neither did I. Elvis looked toward the engineer. Can we hear it again? They played it again. Elvis listened carefully. This time he noticed something different. The song didn't sound like Johnny's. It didn't sound like his. It sounded like both of them. That was what made it special. Elvis looked at Johnny. You were right. Johnny raised an eyebrow. About what? I shouldn't try to sound like anybody else. Johnny smiled. You remembered. Elvis nodded. I remembered. Johnny leaned back. Good. Then Elvis looked at the $2,000. It was sitting on the table again. He laughed. You still have it. Johnny shrugged. Of course. You're supposed to give it to me. Johnny smiled. I said you earned it. So, Johnny pointed toward the recording. Take the record instead. Elvis laughed. I can't spend a record. No. Johnny became serious. But maybe someday you'll realize it's worth more. Elvis looked at the tape. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Elvis asked, What do you think we should do with it? Johnny answered immediately. Keep it. Why? Because moments like this don't happen twice. Elvis looked at him. Johnny continued. You can try to recreate them. He shook his head. But you can't force them. Elvis nodded slowly. He understood. That evening, something unexpected happened. The studio door opened. A record executive walked inside. He had heard a rumor. Two of the most talked-about young singers in America had recorded something together. He wanted to hear it. Johnny looked at Elvis. Elvis looked at Johnny. Neither man said anything. The executive sat down. Play it. The engineer pressed the button. The music began. Johnny watched the executive's face. At first, there was no reaction. Then his eyebrows lifted. When Elvis entered, he leaned forward. By the middle of the song, he was completely focused. When the final note disappeared, he remained silent. Johnny asked, Well, the executive looked at them. Where can I get this? Johnny laughed. You can't. The executive frowned. What do you mean? This wasn't planned. I understand. No. Johnny shook his head. You don't. The executive looked confused. Johnny pointed toward the tape. That happened because nobody was trying to make a record. Elvis nodded. We were just singing. The executive leaned back. But people would pay to hear this. Johnny smiled. Maybe. The executive turned toward Elvis. You could sell millions of copies. Elvis looked uncomfortable. Johnny noticed. He immediately spoke. Don't do it. The executive looked at him. What? Johnny shook his head. Don't turn it into something it isn't. The executive frowned. I'm talking business. I know. Johnny pointed toward the tape. And that's exactly the problem. The room became quiet. Johnny continued. If you polish it too much, you'll kill what makes it special. Elvis looked at him. The executive sighed. So you don't want to release it? Johnny looked toward Elvis. What do you want? Elvis thought. I don't know. Johnny nodded. Then don't rush. The executive stood. Think about it. He left. The door closed. Elvis stared at the floor. Johnny sat beside him. You all right? Elvis nodded. I just don't know what happens next. Johnny smiled. Neither do I. Does that scare you? Johnny laughed. Every day. Elvis looked surprised. You? Johnny nodded. Especially me. Why? Because people think they know who you are once they hear your songs. He looked at Elvis. They don't. Elvis listened. Johnny continued. They hear your voice and decide what kind of man you are. He paused. Then they expect you to become that person forever. Elvis looked down. That sounds exhausting. It is. Johnny leaned back. But you learn something. What? You don't owe everybody an explanation. Elvis smiled faintly. Johnny tapped the table. Just keep making music. Several days passed. The recording remained locked away. Neither man talked publicly about it. The $2,000 became an inside joke between them. Whenever Johnny saw Elvis, he would say, You still want your money? Elvis would answer, Absolutely. And Johnny would laugh. But underneath the jokes, something had changed. There was a deeper friendship. Johnny had seen a side of Elvis that most people never saw. Not the performer, not the young heartthrob, not the man surrounded by screaming fans. The musician, the kid with a guitar who could sit in a quiet room and make everyone forget to breathe. And Elvis had discovered something about Johnny too. Behind the deep voice and serious expression was a man who cared deeply about music. A man who respected honesty more than perfection. One night, the two men sat outside the studio. The city was quiet. Elvis looked toward the street. Do you ever wonder where all this is going? Johnny smiled. All the time. You think we'll still be doing this in 10 years? Johnny laughed. Probably. 20. Johnny shrugged. Maybe. Elvis smiled. 50. Johnny laughed harder. You're getting carried away. Elvis looked at him. I mean it. Johnny became quiet. Then he said, Maybe people won't remember the money. Elvis looked at him. Maybe they won't remember the studio. Johnny nodded. But if we're lucky. He looked toward the city lights. They'll remember the songs. Elvis smiled. And the people. Johnny shook his head. Songs are how people remember people. Elvis thought about that. Then he asked, What do you want people to remember about you? Johnny didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, That I told the truth. Elvis nodded. And you? Johnny looked at him. What do you want them to remember? Elvis smiled. That I made them feel something. Johnny extended his hand. Elvis shook it. Then we are doing the right thing. Months later, the tape was still sitting in the studio, untouched, forgotten by almost everyone. But one person had not forgotten: the engineer. He knew what was on that tape. He knew that someday people might want to hear it. He carefully stored it away, labeled it, protected it, and waited. Because sometimes the most important recordings aren't the ones made with millions of dollars behind them. They're the ones made when nobody is trying to create history. Just two musicians, two guitars, two voices, and one moment. But then, one afternoon, the engineer received a phone call. His expression changed as he listened. He hung up slowly, then walked toward the locked cabinet where the tape was stored. He opened it. He took the recording out and stared at the label. There was a reason someone had called. A reason the recording suddenly mattered again. Because a major event was approaching, and someone wanted to know whether Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley would allow that forgotten performance to be heard by the world. The engineer knew there was only one problem. If the tape was released, the world would finally hear what had happened inside that little studio. And neither Johnny nor Elvis knew what that could mean. He picked up the telephone. The first call would be to Johnny Cash. The second would be to Elvis Presley. And before either man could answer, the engineer already knew one thing. The $2,000 bet was about to become a story far bigger than either singer ever imagined. The telephone rang just after sunrise. Johnny Cash was still at home when he heard it. He almost ignored the call. Then it rang again. And again. Something about the persistence made him get up. He answered. "Hello." There was silence on the other end. Then the familiar voice of the studio engineer. "Johnny, I need to talk to you." Johnny frowned. "About what?" "The recording." Johnny's expression changed. "What recording?" The engineer paused. "You know exactly which one." Johnny sat down. The room suddenly felt quieter. "The one with Elvis." "Yes." Johnny leaned back. "What about it?" "Someone wants to release it." Johnny said nothing. The engineer continued. "They've heard it." "Who?" "A record executive." Johnny sighed. "Of course. They think it could be huge." Johnny stared at the wall. "That's exactly what I was afraid of. They're offering money." "How much?" The engineer told him. Johnny laughed once. Not because it was funny. Because the amount was almost absurd. "No." The engineer paused. "You're not even going to think about it." "I already thought about it." Johnny stood. "That recording wasn't made for money." "I know." "Then why are we talking about it?" "Because people deserve to hear it." Johnny became silent. That sentence stayed with him. People deserve to hear it. He thought about the night. The small studio. Elvis sitting across from him. The $2,000 on the table. The challenge. The silence. And then that voice. Johnny had forgotten about the money almost immediately. But he had never forgotten the sound. He finally said, "Call Elvis." The engineer hesitated. "I already did." Johnny frowned. "And he wants to talk to you first." Johnny smiled faintly. "Of course he does." Later that afternoon, Elvis arrived at the studio. Johnny was already there. Elvis walked through the door. Neither man spoke immediately. Then Elvis smiled. So, Johnny looked at him. So, they found the tape. Johnny nodded. Elvis sighed. I knew they would. Johnny raised an eyebrow. How? Because nothing stays hidden forever. Johnny laughed. That sounds like something my grandmother would say. Elvis smiled. They sat down. The engineer placed the recording on the table. Nobody touched it. For several seconds, they simply stared at it. Then Elvis asked, "What do you think?" Johnny didn't answer immediately. "What do you think?" Elvis looked down. "I don't know." Johnny nodded. "Neither do I." Elvis picked up the tape. He turned it over in his hand. "Do you remember what we were talking about before we recorded it?" Johnny smiled. "Music." "No." Elvis shook his head. "We were talking about whether a song should be perfect." Johnny laughed. "Oh yeah. You said perfect was boring." Johnny nodded. "And you said people remember mistakes." Elvis smiled. "Then I cracked that note." Johnny laughed. "And proved my point." They both laughed. For a moment, they were back in that room. Young, hungry, excited, still trying to understand where music would take them. Then Elvis became serious. "If we release it." Johnny waited. "What?" "It changes everything." Johnny nodded. "How?" "People will hear us together. So, they'll expect us to do it again." Johnny smiled. "Maybe that's not bad." Elvis shook his head. "It might be." "Why?" "Because the first time was real." Johnny stared at him. Elvis continued. "We weren't trying to make something. We just made something." The room became quiet. Johnny understood. Some moments could be repeated. Others couldn't. The recording captured something that had happened naturally. If they tried to recreate it, it might become performance instead of truth. Johnny finally said, "Then we don't recreate it." Elvis looked at him. "We let the recording speak for itself." Johnny nodded. "Exactly." The decision wasn't easy. The record company wanted changes. They wanted a cleaner introduction, a more polished ending, a stronger arrangement. They wanted the voices balanced differently. They wanted to make the recording sound bigger. Johnny refused. Elvis hesitated. Then he refused too. The producer became frustrated. "You don't understand what you have." Johnny smiled. "We understand exactly what we have." The producer pointed toward the tape. "This could be one of the biggest recordings either of you has ever made." Johnny nodded. "Maybe." "Then why won't you let us improve it?" Johnny looked at him. "Because you're trying to improve something that isn't broken." Silence. Elvis smiled. That sentence stayed in his mind. The producer eventually left. Johnny turned toward Elvis. "You agree?" Elvis nodded. "Completely." Then they listened again. This time, something different happened. They heard themselves without the pressure of the moment. And both men realized the recording wasn't powerful because it was perfect. It was powerful because it wasn't. There were tiny breaths, small hesitations, a guitar string that wasn't perfectly tuned, a voice that cracked, a moment where Johnny almost entered too early, a moment where Elvis smiled while singing. Those imperfections made the recording human. Johnny looked at the engineer. "Don't change anything." The engineer nodded. Nothing. Nothing. Elvis smiled. Leave it exactly as it was. The recording was finally prepared. But before it could be released, Johnny asked Elvis to meet him alone. They sat in the studio late at night. No musicians. No executives. No cameras. Just the two of them. Johnny placed the $2,000 on the table. Elvis stared at it. You still have that? Johnny smiled. I told you. You're obsessed with this money. Johnny laughed. No. He pushed it toward Elvis. Take it. Elvis stared at him. Why? Because you won. Elvis smiled. You said the money didn't matter. It doesn't. Then why give it to me? Johnny leaned back. Because sometimes a man should keep his word. Elvis looked at the money, then slowly pushed it back. I don't want it. Johnny raised an eyebrow. You sure? Elvis nodded. I'd rather have the recording. Johnny smiled. Why? Because that's something we made. Johnny looked at him. Together. Together. Johnny slowly picked up the money, then put it away. All right. They shook hands. But neither man realized that this small decision would become one of the most meaningful parts of the story. Because the money had started the challenge. The music had ended it. When the recording was finally announced, nobody knew what to expect. The story spread quickly. Johnny Cash, Elvis Presley, one recording, one studio, one unforgettable night. People wanted to hear it. Radio stations wanted it. Fans wanted it. The record company wanted it to become a major event. But Johnny and Elvis didn't promote it with dramatic speeches. They simply let the music speak. The first time it was played publicly, Johnny was listening from a small room. Elvis was somewhere else. The recording began. Johnny's voice filled the room. Then Elvis. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the phones started ringing. People wanted to know who was singing. They wanted to know where the recording came from. They wanted more. Johnny smiled. He already knew. The music had done what music was supposed to do. It made people feel. Later that night, Johnny called Elvis. So, Elvis laughed. So, they liked it. I heard. Johnny smiled. You surprised? A little. Why? Elvis became quiet. Because I thought people wanted perfection. Johnny shook his head. No. What do they want? Johnny answered. Something real. A few weeks later, Johnny and Elvis met again. The two men were sitting backstage before a performance. Johnny looked at Elvis. You know what I've been thinking. What? That night. Elvis smiled. The bet. Johnny nodded. You know what the strangest part is? What? I was so certain I was going to win. Elvis laughed. You were. Johnny shook his head. No. He smiled. I was certain you were going to lose. Elvis laughed. That's different. Johnny nodded. But then you sang. Elvis looked at him. And Johnny paused. I realized something. What? I didn't actually want to beat you. Elvis frowned. Then why challenge me? Johnny smiled. Because sometimes you challenge someone because you want to know what they're capable of. Elvis nodded slowly. Johnny continued. And sometimes. He looked at Elvis. You challenge someone because you want them to surprise you. Elvis smiled. You were surprised. Completely. Johnny leaned back. I've never forgotten the way the room went quiet. Elvis smiled. Neither have I. They sat silently for a moment. Then Elvis asked, would you do it again? Johnny laughed. The bet. The song. Johnny thought. Yes. But no money. Absolutely no money. Elvis smiled. Good. Johnny picked up his guitar. Elvis picked up his. They began playing. No cameras. No audience. No executives. Just two musicians. And once again, the room changed. Years would pass. The careers of both men would grow. They would perform in enormous venues. They would become symbols of American music. Their names would become larger than the rooms where they had started. But neither man forgot that little studio. Johnny remembered the $2,000. Elvis remembered the first chord. The engineer remembered the silence after the final note. And everyone who eventually heard the recording remembered something else. The feeling. Because the recording didn't sound like two famous singers trying to prove something. It sounded like two human beings discovering each other through music. That was why it lasted. That was why people cared. And that was why the story of the $2,000 became almost irrelevant. The money had been temporary. The music wasn't. One evening, long after the original recording had been made, Johnny found himself alone backstage. He was holding his guitar. A young musician approached him. Mr. Cash. Johnny looked up. Yes. I heard that story. What story? The one about Elvis. Johnny smiled. What did you hear? That you bet $2,000 that he couldn't sing better than you. Johnny laughed. That's one version. Did you lose? Johnny thought for a moment. Yes. The young musician looked surprised. Johnny continued. And I was glad I did. Why? Johnny looked at him. Because losing to someone extraordinary is sometimes better than winning against someone ordinary. The young musician smiled. Johnny pointed toward his guitar. Never be afraid of being surprised. Why? Because that's how you know you're still learning. The young musician nodded. Johnny leaned back. And if someone ever challenges you, he smiled. Don't worry about proving you're better. What should I do? Johnny answered. Give them something they'll remember. That was the real lesson of the night. Elvis hadn't won because his voice was louder. He hadn't won because he was younger. He hadn't won because he was already becoming famous. He won because he forgot about winning. He simply sang. And Johnny Cash, confident enough to put $2,000 on a table, was humble enough to admit when something moved him. That combination was rare. Perhaps that was why the moment survived. Because neither man needed to destroy the other to become great. Johnny could admire Elvis. Elvis could respect Johnny. And both could walk away better musicians than they had been before. But there was still one final piece of the story. The engineer had kept something else from that night. Something that wasn't part of the official recording. Something that happened after everyone thought the microphones had been turned off. A few seconds of conversation. A private exchange between Johnny and Elvis. A moment nobody else was supposed to hear. The engineer had accidentally left the recorder running. And years later, when that forgotten piece of tape was discovered. It revealed what Johnny Cash had really thought about Elvis Presley. Not as a superstar, not as a rival, but as a human being. And the final words on that tape would explain why Johnny never forgot that $2,000 bet. Because after Elvis finished singing, Johnny had leaned toward him and said something that had nothing to do with music at all. Something Elvis would remember for the rest of his life. The recording had already become a story. But the story wasn't finished. For years, people remembered the challenge. $2,000 on a table. Johnny Cash smiling. Elvis Presley picking up his guitar. And then that voice filling a room until everyone forgot there had ever been a bet. But there was one thing almost nobody knew. The recorder had never completely stopped. After the final chord disappeared, the engineer thought the session was over. He had lowered the volume. He had begun organizing the equipment. The musicians were already leaving. Johnny and Elvis remained in the room. They thought they were alone. They didn't know that the microphone was still capturing every word. Elvis put his guitar down. Johnny sat quietly beside him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Elvis laughed softly. "I still can't believe you put $2,000 on the table." Johnny smiled. "I was confident." "You were crazy." Johnny laughed. "Maybe." Elvis looked at the guitar. "I almost didn't do it." Johnny turned toward him. "Why?" Elvis shrugged. "Because I knew you were serious." Johnny nodded. "I was." Elvis looked down. "That's what scared me." Johnny's expression changed. "Scared you?" Elvis nodded. For a second, Johnny leaned forward. "Why?" Elvis hesitated. Then he said something that surprised him. "Because sometimes when people challenge you, they're not really asking whether you're good." Johnny waited. "They're asking whether you're good enough to deserve being there." Johnny stared at him. Elvis continued. "And I've spent a lot of time wondering that." The room became silent. Johnny slowly leaned back. He understood. More than Elvis realized. Because Johnny had felt the same thing. The pressure. The expectations. The fear that one day the audience would stop listening. The fear that maybe the last great song had already been written. The fear that maybe the next performance would prove everyone wrong. Johnny looked at Elvis. Then he said the words that had never been intended for the public. "Listen to me." Elvis raised his eyes. "You don't have to earn your right to be here every night." Elvis didn't move. Johnny continued. "You're already here." He pointed toward the microphone. "That's enough." Elvis looked away. Johnny's voice became softer. "Don't let fame convince you that you have to become somebody else." Elvis swallowed. "You think I can handle it?" Johnny smiled. "I think you're stronger than you know." Then Johnny paused. "But strength doesn't mean you never get tired." Elvis looked at him. "It means you know when to put the guitar down." Those words stayed in the room. Neither man knew they were being recorded. Neither man knew someone would hear them years later. Johnny continued. "And if you ever forget why you started." He pointed toward the guitar. "Come back to this." Elvis slowly nodded. "This music." Johnny smiled. "Before the money." He pointed toward the door. "Before the crowds." Then toward the microphone. "Before everybody has an opinion about you." He looked directly into Elvis's eyes. Remember who you were before anyone knew your name." Elvis's eyes became wet. He quickly looked away. Johnny pretended not to notice. That was the kind of friendship they had. No unnecessary questions. No embarrassing sympathy. Just understanding. Elvis finally smiled. "You know something." "What?" "You sound like my father." Johnny laughed. "That's unfortunate." Elvis laughed too. The tension disappeared. But the words remained. The engineer would later discover that private recording. And he would understand that it was more valuable than anything else from that night. Not because it contained perfect singing. Because it contained two men speaking honestly when they thought nobody was listening. Years passed. The world changed. Music changed. Technology changed. The audiences became larger. The stages became brighter. Elvis became one of the most famous entertainers on earth. Johnny continued building a career defined by honesty and unmistakable character. Their lives became increasingly complicated. But the memory of that night remained. Johnny would sometimes tell the story. He would laugh about the money. He would imitate Elvis looking at the $2,000. He would tell people that he thought the young singer was nervous. But whenever someone asked him what made Elvis special, Johnny's answer was always different. He never talked about fame first. He never talked about appearance. He never talked about records. He talked about feeling. "He made you believe him," Johnny would say. That was the difference. A singer could hit every note. A singer could have perfect technique. A singer could have a beautiful voice. But if the audience didn't believe the emotion, something was missing. Elvis understood that instinctively. He didn't just sing words. He inhabited them. And Johnny recognized it immediately. One afternoon, the young musician from backstage returned. He had become a performer himself. He walked into Johnny's dressing room holding a guitar. Johnny looked at him. "You came back." The musician smiled. "I remembered what you told me." "What did I tell you?" "Don't be afraid of being surprised." Johnny smiled. "And I got surprised." Johnny laughed. "Good." The young man sat down. "I was playing last night and another singer challenged me." Johnny raised an eyebrow. "Did you bet him $2,000? "No." Johnny laughed. "Good." The young man smiled. "He was better than me." Johnny nodded. "How did that feel?" "Terrible." Johnny laughed. "Then I listened." Johnny smiled. "And I learned." Johnny nodded. "Then you won." The young man looked confused. "I lost." "No." Johnny pointed at him. "You listened." He leaned back. "That's how you win in music." The young musician smiled. Johnny picked up his guitar. "Now play me something." The young man began. Johnny listened. No interruptions. No criticism. Just listening. When the song ended, Johnny said, "You're getting better." The young man smiled. "Because of you." Johnny shook his head. "Because you were willing to lose." That lesson was bigger than the bet. It was bigger than Johnny Cash. Bigger than Elvis Presley. It was about the strange way great artists make each other better. Johnny challenged Elvis. Elvis surprised Johnny. Johnny respected Elvis. Elvis learned from Johnny. And neither man had to destroy the other to prove his own greatness. That was the beauty of the moment. But the story of the forgotten tape still had one final chapter. Years after the original recording, the engineer found the old reel again. It had been stored away for decades. The label was faded. The ink was almost impossible to read. But he knew what it was. He placed the tape into an old machine. The reels began turning. Static filled the room. Then Johnny's voice. Then Elvis. The song. The laughter. The final chord. And then the private conversation. The engineer stopped moving. He listened. Johnny's words filled the room. Remember who you were before anyone knew your name. The engineer lowered his head. He had heard famous people speak thousands of times. But those words felt different. They weren't meant for an audience. They weren't meant for history. They were meant for one young man who was carrying a future too heavy for him. The engineer realized something. The most important part of that night had never been the singing. It had been what happened after the singing. Two men sitting in a quiet room. One trying to understand his future. The other reminding him not to lose himself. The engineer carefully rewound the tape. Then he placed it back in its box. He never released the private conversation. He believed some moments belonged to the people who lived them. But he preserved it, because he knew that someday someone might need to hear it. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Johnny Cash had placed $2,000 on a table because he thought he was challenging Elvis Presley. But Elvis never really competed. He simply sang. And when he finished, Johnny didn't feel defeated. He felt grateful. Grateful that someone had reminded him what music could still do. Grateful that he had been surprised. Grateful that he had witnessed something that couldn't be manufactured. And Elvis walked away with something money could never buy. Respect. Not from the audience. Not from critics. From another musician who understood exactly how difficult it was to stand behind a microphone and reveal something real. Years later, the $2,000 would become just a funny detail in the story. The real prize had been something else. A friendship. A lesson. A recording. A memory. And a reminder that the greatest artists don't always compete with each other. Sometimes they recognize each other. Imagine that little studio again. The microphones. The guitars. The empty chairs. The stack of money on the table. Johnny Cash sitting across from Elvis Presley. At the beginning of the night, Johnny had looked at Elvis and asked, "Can you sing better than me?" Elvis didn't answer with an argument. He didn't boast. He didn't tell Johnny how talented he was. He picked up his guitar. And he sang. By the end, Johnny had stopped thinking about the bet. Because something had changed. He wasn't listening to a competitor anymore. He was listening to an artist. And when the final note disappeared, Johnny understood something that would stay with him for years. Talent can impress people. Fame can attract people. Money can motivate people. But emotion makes people remember. That's what Elvis gave Johnny that night. Not a defeat. Not a victory. A memory. A moment when an entire room forgot to breathe. And perhaps that's why the story has lasted. Because beneath the legend, beneath the records, beneath the fame, there were two human beings. One with a deep voice. One with a remarkable voice. Both uncertain. Both ambitious. Both afraid of failing. Both trying to find the truth inside a song. And for a few minutes, they found it together. So what happened to the $2,000? Johnny kept it, at least for a while. The money became a private joke between them. Whenever Elvis reminded him about the bet, Johnny would laugh. Maybe next time. And Elvis would answer, next time, make it 5,000. Johnny would shake his head. I'm not making that mistake again. They would laugh, because by then they both knew the truth. The money had never mattered. The challenge had never really mattered. The only thing that mattered was what happened after Elvis picked up that guitar. He didn't try to prove he was better than Johnny Cash. He proved something much more important, that he could make another great artist stop competing and simply listen. And Johnny Cash, a man famous for his confidence and unmistakable voice, was humble enough to admit, I was wrong. Not wrong about Elvis being talented. Wrong about what the night was supposed to be. It wasn't a contest. It was a discovery. And if you're still watching this story, tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? Because stories like this travel farther than music ever could. If this moment between Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley touched you, like this video, share it with someone who loves classic music, and subscribe for more cinematic stories about the legends whose greatest moments happened when nobody expected them. Because sometimes history isn't made under bright lights. Sometimes it happens in a small room. Sometimes there is no audience. Sometimes there isn't even a camera. Sometimes there are only two musicians, two guitars, one microphone, and a challenge that was never really about money. The final image of that night is simple. Johnny Cash sits quietly with his guitar. Elvis Presley sits across from him. The $2,000 rests untouched nearby. The microphones are still warm. The room is almost empty. And for one brief moment, neither man is thinking about fame. Neither is thinking about the future. Neither is thinking about who will become more successful. They are simply listening to each other. And perhaps that is why Johnny Cash remembered the night. Not because Elvis won the bet. Not because $2,000 changed hands. But because, for a few minutes, one of the greatest singers in American music made another great singer forget everything except the song. Johnny had challenged Elvis to sing better than him. Elvis answered by making Johnny forget there was ever a competition. And that was the real victory. Not $2,000. Not applause. Not fame. Just two voices, two guitars, and one unforgettable lesson. The greatest artist in the room isn't always the one who sings the loudest. Sometimes it's the one who makes everyone else feel something they can never forget.